My name is Claire Schaefer-Duffy, and I am the program director at the Center for Nonviolent Solutions and want to welcome everybody. It's a little surreal not being able to see all of your faces. We need the eyes to communicate and understand each other, but here we are. The Center for Nonviolent Solutions is a small nonprofit that's committed to building a culture of peace in Worcester and beyond. It's a big mission, a work of many, many parts. And the part that we're engaged in is education. So who are we? We, in addition to myself, we are the indefatigable and remarkable administrator, Rochelle Perrette, who's doing all the tech on today's program. So a big bow of gratitude to Rochelle. We also have a small board and an expanding crew of young interns who in this season of COVID are all very interested in peace education. The work that we do includes teaching youth and their educators skills for nonviolent conflict resolution. And we've had programs in the schools. And we also do occasional presentations to the general public on active nonviolence. COVID has limited our access to the young people. It's expanded our access to the adults through Zoom. So in 2021, we've been doing monthly programs on nonviolence that are available to the general public, of which this is one of them. In March, we are also going to have a second program that will be a week from today, March 30th. We are going to have a virtual annual meeting of the center. So there'll be a brief overview of what we've been up to for the past year. And then our central presenters are Paula Green and Gwen Johnson, speaking about US dialogues in an age of polarization. They have a remarkable story. Paula Green is a peace consultant who's worked all over the world with communities in conflict. And she's brought her skills as a facilitator, as a person who can really get people to speak their stories to the US. She turned her attention to her homeland after the election of President Trump and has developed this project between progressives in Western Mass and a community in Appalachia. You might call it Trump country. They are coal people. They are very different, perhaps we might say, on the political spectrum, but they have come to know and love each other through these regular intentional gatherings. So they're going to talk about that. Gwen is a self-described hillbilly woman who has been part of that initiative. That's March 30th at 7 p.m. If you are not on the center's mailing list, be sure to email us, and I'll put it in the chat box at inquiry@nonviolent solutions. In addition to teaching people skills for making peace, here at the center, we are always eager to uphold nonviolent histories, because these are crucial to understanding that in that thread of history that is so violent, there's also this thread and of nonviolence that's being developed and practiced in so many circumstances. And fundamental to that history are women. They are at the center of it. If you ask many in the general public, peace leader, name a peace leader, typically it's the male ones who come to mind, Dr. Martin Luther King or Gandhi. But there are so many women around the world who are implementing, developing, providing analysis for nonviolent action. So when one of the projects that the center has done, and I just have to do a little PR for us, is a program called We Grow into Courage. It's a dramatic reading of from the writings of women who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the readings are done by women in the community here in Worcester. Several of them are in attendance I want to give a shout out to Regina Edmonds and also Tina Gaffney, because this public multimedia dramatic presentation includes a scene with Fannie Lou Hamer, whom you're going to hear about in detail today. And I think our reader for Fannie is here. So that's my beloved friend, Tina. And Selena helped us with that project. So when she asked about this one, we were more than happy to co-sponsor with the College of the Holy Cross, their departments of history, sociology, and anthropology, the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and Center for Africana Studies. So this is a collaborative effort, but we are so pleased on this time of Women's History Month to feature the author of a new biography of Fannie Lou Hamer. So I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Kate Clifford Larson. She's a New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author of 3 critically acclaimed biographies, including Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy, which Rochelle is currently reading, by the way, Kate, just to let you know. Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, and The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln. She is an award-winning consultant for numerous museum and public history initiatives. She's frequently interviewed by local, national, and international radio programs and media outlets, and has appeared on national and international television broadcasts, including BBC, PBS, C-SPAN, cable networks, most recently CBS Sunday Morning. She is currently a Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center visiting scholar. Her latest work, Walk With Me, a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, is due out from Oxford University Press in October of this year. Dr. Larson is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions. So please put your questions in the chat box. I'll be trying to curate them. And last, before I turn it over to Dr. Larson, if you like programs like this, don't hesitate to donate. There's always a donate button available on the website for the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. You'll find us at www.nonviolentsolutions.org. So welcome, Dr. Larson, on this beautiful spring day.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. And so I'm just going to share my screen. I'm excited to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. And she certainly was devoted to, let me get this up here, nonviolent protest. And there we go. And she became quite an amazing leader, an inspiring leader. And her background did not indicate that she would rise up and become this inspiration for so many people, and also, in my view, change the trajectory of the civil rights movement in many ways. And as Claire was mentioning, you know, when we come to think about the civil rights movement, particularly for younger generations now, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks sort of dominate that story. But there were so many leaders and activists who made incredible contribution and who made a difference during the 1950s and 1960s. And I really feel strongly we need to elevate their stories as well. Because I think it's important for activists today to see that there's a history here, and perhaps they can look to these leaders from the past and the paths that they took and the strategies that they used that may be helpful for people today. So let me get right to Fannie Lou Hamer's story. And I think it's important that people understand where she came from, what she came out of. She didn't just appear on the in the movement in 1962. She had a long history that is actually not very well known. But she was born in October of 1917 in Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. And here is a map of Mississippi. For those of you who don't know where the Delta is the part of Mississippi that is it's one of the most important cotton growing regions, or it was in the world. And it is where millions of African Americans over 150 years labored to create that landscape and the agricultural bounty of those cotton fields. And by the time she was born in 1917, it was an oppressive environment, and she lived with her family under the restrictions of Jim Crow and worse. Sharecropping was an agricultural practice most common in southern states that at one time had relied exclusively on enslaved labor. Sharecropping became the de facto alternative to slavery after the Civil War, tying poor Black and white families to land that they tilled. Instead of wage-based work, farmers rented small plots of land, mainly from white landowners, in return for a portion of their crops as lease payments at harvest time. Lacking literacy and sufficient economic, legal, and political power, Black sharecroppers in particular unwittingly signed deceptive and inequitable rental contracts, forcing them into cycles and generations of perpetual debt and economic bondage. Some African Americans tried to flee the Deep South and these types of contracts, and they were part of the Great Migration around the turn of the last century, going through the 1920s, and even a second wave of migration after the World War II. People were desperate to leave, and the white landowners that needed their labor often used extreme measures to keep people tied to that land, sometimes at gunpoint. Fannie Lou Hamer remembered the great poverty that they endured as sharecroppers. And at one point, her family started to become quite successful. She described a moment where her father had made enough money. There were great crops of cotton and high prices, and he did earn good money, and he was able to buy an automobile and some cows and work animals. And a white neighbor became enraged at his sort of climbing up the economic ladder, and he poisoned their animals and destroyed their truck. And that set them back, and she said they never recovered. And this was in the 1920s. Fannie Lou Hamer was the 20th child of, the 20th child of Ella and Jim Townsend. And there are a lot of myths or incomplete stories about Fannie Lou Hamer's family. They were, she often talked about the 20 children, and she was the last one, and that she was the favorite in the family. Well, I discovered that the reason she was the favorite, or one of the reasons she was the favorite in the family, is that indeed she was the last one, but 4 babies born before her died. And so when Fannie Lou was born and she survived, her parents viewed her as very, very special. And she was very special. She was very, very gifted. But growing up in the shacks and in the fields of the Delta, it was a very difficult life. The survival rate for Black children was very low. 1 out of 5 would die, 1 out of 4 would die before their 5th birthday, which was a much higher rate than white children. The conditions that they lived in were dire, very unhealthy sanitary conditions, and disease spread through these sharecropper cabins. And it was very difficult to access health care, which became a passion of Hamer's later in her life. So access to healthcare, sanitary environments, nutrition, food insecurity was a constant threat. Fannie Lou Hamer talked about being hungry all the time as a child and how her mother struggled to feed them. It was a very, very difficult life. She talks about in her speeches that she used to say to her mother that she wished that she was white, and her mother got very, very angry with her and told her to be proud that she was a Black child and that she was a Black girl. And her mother found enough money to purchase a little Black doll for her so that she would grow up with pride in being a Black woman. And she told her that if she didn't have pride in herself, then no one else would respect her either. And Hamer clearly took that to heart. She grew up, as I said, quite the favorite. She was a brilliant child. She only was able to achieve a 6th grade education. Education for sharecroppers was minimal at best. 3 months, maybe 4 months of the year, they went to school, and the schools were often in shacks on plantations. Public school education for African Americans in Mississippi in particular was it was almost non-existent. And so, but she was very bright, and she was a voracious reader. And so that served her very well in her ability to incorporate whatever she could. Her mother sometimes would clean in white people's homes, and Fannie Lou would go with her, and she would spy magazines or newspapers and read them. So she was constantly trying to feed her thirst for knowledge. Her mother was an amazing influence on her, a fierce woman determined to keep her children alive and to feed them and take care of them and protect them. And Fannie Lou talked about going into the fields, and her mother would carry their lunch in buckets, and then this mysterious bucket that she carried that was always covered. And it wasn't until Hamer was a little bit older that she realized that her mother was carrying a gun in that bucket, and that she needed it because she wanted to protect her daughters from white bosses who might come into the fields and demand that they have access to her daughters and her nieces. So she was quite the brave and courageous woman. And Fannie Lou talked about how some people thought that her mother Ella was crazy because she stood up to white men. But Fannie Lou learned not to be afraid of them and learned to stand up herself by watching her mother. She had an amazing voice. She is renowned for her singing. This was born of her participation in church and the singing in the fields, the field hollers, and the call and shout games that she played with her friends. The singing in church, definitely, but also the Mississippi Delta is the birthplace of Mississippi Delta blues. In fact, in the community that she lived in, Ruleville, Mississippi, 6 miles from there is considered the birthplace of Mississippi blues. So blues singers were everywhere, and they were performing at juke houses and in fields and in barns and in shacks all over the place. Some of the greatest blues singers in the world came out of the Mississippi Delta. Fannie Lou Hamer heard this music, and in her voice, when you hear it, you can hear that bit of blues in her tone and the way she sings her songs. And one blues historian and singer told me that Fannie Lou Hamer lived a blues-filled life, and it showed in her music that she sang as well. Throughout the Great Depression, her family suffered greatly, but they survived and they managed on the plantation that they lived on. Her older siblings moved away and established their own sharecropping lives on other plantations. Some moved to northern cities like Indianapolis, Chicago, St. Louis. So she was left there with her mother and father, who were getting older during the 1930s. Her father died in 1939 of a stroke. Her mother, unfortunately, during the Great Depression, was working in a field trying to break up old roots and branches, and a piece of wood flew up in her eye, and her eye got infected. And because they didn't have access to health care, she went blind. So Fannie Lou Hamer had to take care of her mother from a very young age. In 1938, she married a man by the name of Charlie Gray. It doesn't seem that they lived together much because Hamer lived with her mother on another plantation, but they did get married. And then in 1943, he divorced her. He said that in the divorce complaint that she had taken up with another man. Well, this other man was Pap Hamer, which you see here. He was also a sharecropper who worked on the Marlowe plantation outside of Ruleville in Sunflower County, Mississippi. He was tall and handsome. He was a mechanic actually on the plantation as well, which gave him higher status on the farm. He made a little bit more money. He also made bootleg liquor, and he ran a little juke house in his home on the plantation. So I surmise that Fannie Lou and Pap met maybe at his juke house or at some other blues place in the 1940s, but they did get married in 1944, and she moved to his cabin on the Marlowe plantation. So she often talked about how she had no knowledge or no understanding of the civil rights movement or what was going on in the rest of the world. And in one way, I would have believed her, because access to outside information for Mississippi sharecroppers in particular was very limited. Access to northern newspapers was difficult. They certainly didn't get news, Mississippi local news, that was about any civil rights activity around the country. But she, in fact, was very, very well informed. Near where she lived, about 15 miles away, was an all-Black community called Mound Bayou. And Mound Bayou was the location of rallies every year for, they were sort of like mass meetings, but white people believed it was more like a camp meeting where religious leaders came from all over the place, and thousands of people would show up and listen to great speakers. But they also had speakers like Thurgood Marshall, who in 1954 argued in front of the Supreme Court the Brown v. Board of Education case, and he won that case. Well, he was a speaker at the Mound Bayou days. And Mahalia Jackson sang there, and other leaders in the movement did go there and speak to the crowds during the 1950s. Fannie Lou Hamer actually was famous for her singing, and she would sing there, and she would cook barbecue for thousands of people as well. She was one of the many cooks there that would participate. So it wasn't like she was uninformed. She certainly was. She also joined the NAACP. It was a small organization in Mississippi, and but she did try to talk to people about becoming members. So she was not as informed as she often claimed when she became more famous. But things were heating up in the 1950s, as many of you know, after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and the court demanded that it be enacted with deliberate speed. The white reaction was swift and tragic, and there was a lot of violence across the South, more than normal. And of course, we have the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till, which happened about 30 miles from Hamer's home in Ruleville. He was murdered and dumped in Tallahatchie, Mississippi. And the same year, that December, Rosa Parks sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. So things were starting to happen, and of course, Fannie Lou would have been very well aware of those movements in spite of what she claimed later. And in 1957, of course, the Little Rock Nine and the desegregation of the Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School, followed by many different things that were going on in the 1950s and then into the 1960s, with the student movement beginning in 1960 with the sit-ins at lunch counters and restaurants. And these activities were gaining more and more national attention. And again, I have to say, there's no way that Fannie Lou Hamer did not know that these things were happening. When the bus integration efforts started in 1961 with the Freedom Rides, they rode through Mississippi, and they were attacked and firebombed, as you can see in this photograph. Here's an image of young John Lewis, our congressman who passed away recently, who was attacked at a bus station. Even these stories ended up in Mississippi across the front pages. So Hamer would have been knowledgeable and knew that these things were happening around her and in communities not too far from Ruleville. But she was busy raising a family with her husband, Pap. She had been struggling to conceive a child with him, and she had had at least 2 stillbirths and miscarriages. They adopted 2 girls, Dorothy, Jean, and Virgie, and they were raising them in their home. But she still was looking to become a mother. And they had a more comfortable life on the Marlowe plantation. Fannie Lou, because she was literate and she was so bright, the Marlowes hired her to be the timekeeper on the plantation, where she would log in all the laborers. She would help weigh the cotton and record the cotton and how much each laborer or sharecropper was owed. So she had an important job on the plantation as well. So they were fairly comfortable compared to other sharecropping families. But she suffered physically. She had health issues, and particularly with fibroid tumors in her uterus, and they were bothering her tremendously. And Mrs. Marlowe recommended that she go to a cousin of hers, Dr. Charles Darrow, to have the fibroid tumors removed. Well, instead of removing them, he sterilized her and did not tell her. And she only found out when she was recuperating at home after the surgery, when the cook from the plantation, the Marlowe's plantation, came to her and said that she heard Mrs. Marlowe talking to a friend and telling her that Dr. Darrow had sterilized Fannie Lou Hamer. You can imagine how devastated she was, that she had lost her ability to conceive a child, and she had made no choice in that decision. She called it the Mississippi appendectomy. Was actually a phrase that was used by other people. The sterilization of African-American women was far more common than people knew. It was a deep, dark secret that was happening throughout the South and to white women as well, like in Appalachia, etc. It would be until the 1970s when courts would come down and say that these sterilizations had to stop, that they couldn't be done against a woman's will, or they couldn't be tricked into having sterilization either. But Fannie Lou Hamer was reaching a breaking point. She was sick and tired, and she used that phrase a lot. She was sick and tired of the abuse and the deceit and the robbing of parts of their lives by the whites in their communities and the white power structure. So that sterilization sort of launched her into a different mindset and a different place. At that very time, these major civil rights organizations, COFO, which is the Council of Federated Organizations, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which Dr. Martin Luther King was a part of, the NAACP, of course, which most of you know about, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was just being established for young people to sort of tap into and organize the energy of these young people that were doing the freedom bus rides, and they were doing the sit-ins and lunch counters, and they were becoming activated on college campuses. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was becoming organized and established through the help of these other organizations. And then the CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, was another organization. And these were coming into more power and working more closely together, although they never worked really, really closely together, but they started working together. And these two people, Robert Moses here, a young Harvard graduate, and Ella Baker, who was an important person in the SCLC. She was vice president of the organization at one point. She struggled with the organization because it was dominated by men. She was never given complete managerial control or even the presidency of the organization, and no other women rose in the ranks either too, and it was very frustrating to her. She really thought that the future of the movement was with young people, so she nurtured Bob Moses and other young people to create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he hit upon an idea to establish field secretaries and offices in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, et cetera. But he was fascinated with Mississippi. He thought it would be the greatest struggle and the most important place to go. So he and others decided to set up meetings in Mississippi to encourage people to register to vote. They recognized that only with the vote could people make a change. And in Mississippi, fewer than 5% of eligible African Americans could vote. The literacy tests, the poll taxes prevented most from being able to even get registered. And others didn't register because they didn't know how, they weren't told how, or they just assumed they weren't able to vote. And the repercussions against Black people who did register vote were often quite severe. So in the summer of 1962, Bob Moses and others arrived in Ruleville, where Fannie Lou Hamer was living, and they held a mass meeting at William Chapel, this church right here that's still there in Ruleville, and encourage people to register to vote. And Fannie Lou Hamer decided that she would go to this meeting. She had been she had reached the end of her rope. And while she claimed that she had to be dragged to this meeting, that is not true at all. She wanted to go. She was interested in going. And when she heard Bob Moses and James Foreman and all these other speakers talk about empowering themselves by trying to register to vote, to make a difference in Mississippi, to change the circumstances of their lives in Mississippi, she was ready to go. Her anger had pushed her to the point that she was ready to do something more. This is just an image of a voter registration literacy test that people had to take in order to register to vote. And interestingly, most white people who were illiterate, and there were many illiterate white people in Mississippi, they were given a pass. They could just sign an X and they would be registered to vote, but they required African Americans to fill this out completely and interpret a particular passage of the Constitution of Mississippi and put that down on this form. So it was punitive, it was difficult, it was designed so that African Americans could not register to vote. So she decided to join 17 others at the end of August to go to the Sunflower County Registry of Deeds and the Circuit Court and register to vote. She filled out the form as best she could. She was literate, so she could do it, although she had no idea how to interpret the particular section of the Constitution that the court clerk required that she interpret. When she got home, after registering to vote, the boss, W.D. Marlowe, came storming to her cabin, her home, and asked her what she had done. And she told him that she had gone to register to vote. And he told her she had to go back the next day and withdraw her registration because he wasn't going to have any of that. And she said that she told him that she didn't go register for him, she went to register for herself. And she wasn't going back and withdrawing her registration. Well, that night he evicted her from the plantation. And she went into the town of Ruleville, spent the night with friends, but her husband, Pap, realized that she was in great danger and had heard through the grapevine that there might be an attack on her life. So he got her out of Ruleville and sent her to a neighboring county to live for 2 or 3 months to stay away from the danger. And in fact, just a couple of days after she left Ruleville, some white vigilantes drove through the Black community in the city of Ruleville and shot bullets into different homes. They injured 2 young girls, but they blasted windows and doors in several different homes, including the home that Fannie Lou Hamer had been staying in, and bullets pierced the walls just above the bed that she had been sleeping in. So she knew that she was in great danger. But she decided that she would come back to Ruleville. She wasn't going to hide out anymore, that she was going to stand up to her oppressors, and she wasn't going to take it anymore. And she impressed the SNCC workers so much, Bob Moses and the others, for her courage. And they had been talking to other people in the community while Fannie Lou was away, and they realized that they looked at her as a leader. So they organized, they got her and they started training her to be a field secretary and an organizer so that she could help other people try to take the voter registration test. In the spring of 1963, she was sent to a class in South Carolina to learn more skills on how to organize people, techniques in teaching them how to take the test, literacy techniques, etc. And on the way back, she was with several other people, SNCC operatives and field secretaries and field organizers and voter registration people. They stopped in their bus in Winona, Montgomery County, Mississippi, at Staley's Cafe. And at all the cafes and restaurants and bus stops along the way to and from South Carolina, they had purposely gone into the cafes that were generally segregated, although at that point it was illegal because the government had passed laws saying that it was illegal, and the Interstate Commerce Commission had set rules that you could not have segregated restaurants or restrooms at bus stations. But they were segregated in many of these places, but nobody said anything to these SNCC workers who went to integrate them, except when they arrived in Winona, Mississippi. The owner of the cafe became furious. Police arrived, arrested Hamer and 5 other of the SNCC workers who were trying to integrate the cafe. They brought them to the jail, the Winona County Jail, and there Hamer and these 4 individuals, Annelle Ponder, Uvester Simpson, who was about 17 years old, June Johnson, who was 16 years old, and Lawrence Guillot, who was 25 years old, they were arrested, brought to the jail with Hamer, and they beat them brutally beat them with billy clubs and blackjacks and their fists. It was horrific. And Hamer talked in her speeches for the rest of her life about the beatings that she listened to, that she witnessed, and the one that she endured herself at the hands of white policemen and Black prisoners who were ordered to beat her as well. She was also raped by one of the white policemen as well. It was for 4 days they were in jail, and finally activists from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the NAACP and SNCC were able to bail them out and get them out of jail on June 12th. And as they were riding home to Ruleville, Mississippi, they heard the news that Medgar Evers, who is the NAACP person in Mississippi, had been murdered in his driveway. This is a picture of Fannie Lou Hamer when she arrived back in near her home. The FBI was there to take her statement, and she didn't trust the FBI, but they did take her picture. And this is the photograph, one photograph that they took of her. Later, they did take more photographs of her wounds. The photographs are quite graphic, and she is naked, and so I won't show them. But the bruising is incredible, what they did to her body with those blackjacks, and it's just horrific. This beating changed her again, and she said later, quote, "If them crackers in Winona thought they'd discourage me from fighting, I guess they found out different. I'm going to stay in Mississippi, and if they shoot me down, I'll be buried here." Her anger pushed her further, and she took more risks and became more determined that she was going to find a way to make a way to stand up and stand out and speak up and make a difference in Mississippi. Her commitment became more profound, and she found solace in her faith. She was incredibly spiritual, and she sought solace in her faith, and it supported her and it sustained her for the rest of her life and helped her endure these wounds physically and psychologically. Of course, as the movement geared up, the white reaction became more horrific and violent. Here's the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and the killing of the 4 little girls, followed by Martin Luther King's March on Washington, which just aggravated white people even more, and their reaction was even more violent in return. And Hamer saw this happening around the world, and it wasn't going to stop her. She started protesting more and trying to find her place in a movement that was beginning to grow. And she looked at these young people who looked at her as a leader, but she felt committed that the voice of the grassroots people, the poor, the uneducated, Mississippi sharecroppers needed to be heard, that the leaders in the movement who were well educated, who were high profile, were not necessarily the voice of her people. So she was trying to figure out how she could make her way and become more powerful. She did, because she used her voice, that powerful singing voice. People were drawn to her. When she would sing, they would come around and she would energize them and motivate them. And when she gave speeches, she sprinkled her or peppered her speeches with biblical passages and interpretations of the Bible and how God really demanded that they go out and change the world and do something, that they shouldn't be satisfied, that they could inherit the earth and they just had to move to do that. In 1964, SNCC and those other organizations decided to commit to Mississippi Freedom Summer. They would bring 1,000 students from the North and West, all over the country, down to Mississippi to open community centers, freedom schools, and to have a huge voter registration drive to help people try to register to vote. Ultimately, about 850 young students came and volunteers came to Mississippi, and they did amazing things. There were about 47 schools that they opened, and not only for children, those schools served adults who were illiterate, who wanted to learn to read and write as well. And their voter registration campaigns were very, very effective, although Mississippi kept people who tried to register, kept them from actually registering. But the point is that the movement helped people become not afraid anymore to try to register. The repercussions for people who tried to register were grave. Fannie Lou Hamer was not the only person who was evicted from their home after trying to register. Many people were. They lost their jobs. They had violence inflicted upon them. It was a very, very difficult situation. And Hamer became very frustrated with some of her friends, some of her neighbors, and also ministers. Many Mississippi ministers did not want to participate in the movement, partly out of fear. Mississippi churches were burned down all the time. And also they had become complacent and they didn't want to rock the boat. Well, she would call them out in many, many speeches. And I just would like to read this one comment that she said. She went to see one minister and she stood up on the pulpit and told him that he needed to be Moses and take her people to the courthouse to register to vote. and calling him out in church in front of his congregation left him in an awkward position, but he had to take those people to the courthouse to register to vote and to bear the brunt of the repercussions. The Freedom Summer had many tragedies, excuse me, too. 3 SNCC workers were Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner were abducted by Klan members. They were murdered and buried early in the summer. It took about 6 weeks before their bodies were found, and this was just before the Democratic National Convention, where President Johnson was trying to get Southern support for his nomination and to re-elect him as president in November of 1964. And the treatment of these workers in Mississippi, they were beaten up all the time. Others were killed, churches were bombed, homes were bombed, people were shot at by white vigilantes and the Klan. It was a war zone in Mississippi. And Fannie Lou Hamer was determined, and she faced down those terrorists. Here she is, there's a picture of her. Her home became sort of a hub of activity for SNCC workers. She had a giant pecan tree in her front yard that everyone loved to come and sit under, and they would sing songs, and she would talk to them and inspire them. The police were always present everywhere. Sometimes they served as protection, but more often they were the source of violence against SNCC workers. She helped establish the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, separate from the regular Mississippi all-white Democratic Party, and they were determined that they would be the party to represent Mississippi at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey in August of 1962. Hamer went there with a group of the MFDP people to convince the Democratic Party to let them be the true representatives, because the all-white party did not represent Black people in Mississippi. And Hamer was the center of attention, and they attracted thousands of people on the boardwalk in Atlantic City with her speeches and her singing. Finally, she was allowed to speak at the convention in front of the Credentials Committee that would decide whether the Black delegates could represent Mississippi. There were lots of speakers that day. They were televised on NBC TV live. But when Mrs. Hamer started speaking, the audience was spellbound by her speech. And President Johnson was so shaken, so upset with what she was saying, that he ordered a press conference to interrupt the NBC coverage of her speech. So about 4 minutes into her speech, the news people cut away to President Johnson, who's standing at a podium in the White House, and says, "I just want to remind everybody that 9 months and 6 days and so many hours ago, that President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas." And then he walks away from the podium in time for them to go back to Mrs. Hamer, but she had completed her speech. What he didn't know is that NBC had still continued recording her speech, and everyone was so amazed by it that they broadcast it on national television that night. And the world got to see Fannie Lou Hamer, and they felt an emotional response by what she told them and what was happening in Mississippi, and why African Americans deserve the right to vote, and they wanted it now. So she gained tremendous support. However, the Black male educated leaders of the movement were not pleased. They did not like an uneducated Mississippi sharecropper woman taking the show away from them, and this had profound repercussions for her. Ultimately, they were not allowed to take the seats of the white Mississippi Democratic Party delegates. And Hamer was frustrated and angry, but it spurred her to keep moving on. Her activity, though, got the Democratic National Committee to commit to all state convention delegates in 1968 had to be integrated. She ran for Congress. In that election, of course, she did not win because most Black people could not vote, but she was going to prove that it could be done and inspire other African Americans in Mississippi to follow her. Other powerful women in the state were Annie Devine and Victoria Gray, and they kept pestering congressmen and legislators and other politicians that Mississippi had to be represented by African Americans and women. She knew Dr. Martin Luther King. She believed in nonviolence, and she marched with him. She trusted him up to a certain point. She felt that he betrayed her at the Democratic National Convention, but they were simpatico when it came to nonviolence. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee after 1965 started to fall apart. More militant members wanted to become more non-passive, I shall say, and actually more violent in their response and their protests. And so Fannie Lou Hamer split from them because she was devoted to nonviolence, and she continued her campaign of drawing attention to the needs of the poor and the powerless in Mississippi and elsewhere. And she said the problem of Mississippi is actually the problem of America. She was against the Vietnam War, and she lived through the terror and the violence of the assassination of Malcolm X first. She admired Malcolm X, even though she differed with him on his stance on nonviolence. He felt that people should arm themselves. But then she watched Robert Kennedy assassinated and Martin Luther King as well. The world was still resisting after all these years and all her work and others' work. White people were not giving it up. She did feel powerful and rewarded in the 1968 Democratic National Convention. She was a delegate from Mississippi. She did a lot more locally. She created a farm co-op where local people, she purchased several hundred acres of land with donations and helped people set up their own farms so that they didn't have to be tied to plantation bosses anymore. She brought in Head Start and started organizing unions. And she was just a very grassroots oriented and very powerful. But the movement was moving beyond her, and she started focusing more and more on Mississippi, although the plight of women and Black women remained one of her major focuses. She ran for state senator, and again, she did not win in the early 1970s. And she appeared on many panels and TV shows, and she was more and more angry. She was getting frustrated with the civil rights movement that seemed to be fracturing and moving on beyond the grassroots organizations. And she wanted people to remember that it's the people there living in places like Mississippi that needed the vote, that needed their rights recognized. They needed to be more powerful. And the civil rights leaders seemed to be moving on without them. She was involved with the Women's Political Caucus with Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, and Shirley Chisholm. But by the early 1970s, she was becoming very, very sick as a result of the beating in Winona. Her kidneys were failing, she had diabetes, and she had heart trouble as well. In 1977, she died of breast cancer in Mound Bayou or in Ruleville, near Ruleville in Mississippi. And she died in poverty, which is tragic. She was still a powerful name. Thousands of people came to her funeral. Some of the greatest and most important civil rights leaders of the generation came to Ruleville for her funeral. But it was a disconnect with the fact that she died in poverty. And so she was, in my view, not accorded the courtesy that she should have and the support that she should have towards the end of her life. But she is a remarkable example of someone who came out of the most dire circumstances and rose up to be a leader who inspired thousands and thousands of others, particularly young people, to keep fighting to make the world a better place. Thank you. Let me stop this share here. So if there are any questions, maybe we can take questions. We're running a little bit tight on time, I think, but.
Thank you so much. We could I feel like we need almost 5 minutes of silence just to absorb this tremendous history. And what a reminder that the progress, whatever progress has happened in this country, often comes at great suffering for the people who go before us, and how important it is to know their story and take courage and inspiration. So thank you for your research. Thank you for sharing with us. It is almost 1. We will keep this open for questions, but those who have to leave, we understand. Many have asked if the talk is recorded. It is recorded. It will be posted on the center website within a few days. You can access it there. But let's give some opportunity for those who can stay to ask questions. So one question, Kate, here is how much of her story did you uncover versus what was widely recorded, or what, when you looked into Fannie Lou Hamer's story, what did you find that surprised you that had not been told?
So there's a lot about her early life that had not been researched or documented. So the story of her family life, there's a lot of new information there, and also her activities in the 1940s and 1950s that indicate that she was an activist already, rather than the stories that she perpetuated, that she just kind of appeared in 1962 and decided, oh, all of a sudden she was going to become active in the movement. So there's a lot of that detail. And then since some of the other biographies have come out, there are a lot more there's a lot more documentation that had not been accessed before about her views and her speeches and where she went and who she influenced and how she did what she did, and the courage that it took for her, the danger that she lived with every single day. I think people don't appreciate how her life was threatened constantly because she was willing to stand up so much. And so in my book, I use a lot of testimony from people that knew her, the SNCC workers, a lot of the stuff that's never been used before. I've interviewed people whose voices haven't been heard before about her. So I'm just hoping it's a fresh, new perspective. I talk more about her faith than I think the other biographers in the past have talked about. I weave in her speeches, the way she draws on the Bible and her faith, she uses it in such clever ways that engage audiences that are not familiar with the Bible, that don't really care about the Bible. It just gives her an authority and it empowers her, and you can hear her in speeches where her voice gets louder and louder and louder, and she starts shouting, and then people start clapping and cheering and stomping and whistling. She's amazing, amazing. And just the evolution of her as a woman, as an activist, I think comes out very clearly in the narrative of my biography.
In preparing We Grow into Courage, I was shocked at the level of violence that I think many white Americans don't know that occurred. You used the term war zone in the struggle for just for voting access.
Right.
And many black men were killed.
Mm-hmm.
And Fannie Lou Hamer is an example of a woman who absorbed in her body, that violence. How did she sustain courage? I mean, what specifically did she keep going because you're so.
I think, excuse me, it's a combination of things. First and foremost, it was her faith that sustained her. It gave her the courage. She sought solace in it. It gave her strength when she felt really weak. it kept her focused on nonviolence. Excuse me. And also she was angry. She was mad. And that fueled her too. She didn't want to live that way anymore. She didn't want to see children starving anymore. She didn't want to see people abused anymore. And so that anger and that frustration and the abuse that happened to her, the physical beating and the rape and the sterilization, she just didn't want to take it anymore. She was sick and tired, but she channeled it into this ability to message. And she practiced and she created a persona on stage that was incredibly effective. And some people said that she was as good as Martin Luther King on stage, that she was so powerful in her ability to move an audience. And I believe that's true of her, definitely.
We have a question here about her adopted daughters. Did you interview them? What happened to them? Did they become activists like their mother?
Right. So the two daughters, Dorothy, the older one, died after giving birth to a second child. She was anemic and she hemorrhaged to death, which is really tragic in the 1960s. And the other daughter, Virgie, was a child. She was like 9, 10, 11, 12 years old during the 1960s. So she was not active in the movement. She has died. And then there were the grandchildren of Dorothy, the two daughters. Pap and Fannie Lou raised them as their own daughters, and they have passed as well. So their children are still around. One of them actually is still alive. They're still around. I have not talked to the one that is still alive, but I've talked to other relatives who have told me about Fannie Lou Hamer.
We have another question. There seems to be a growing disregard of the horrific suffering endured by people like Fannie Lou and insensitivity to decades of systemic oppression. What's the best way to engage in education that has compassion and empathy at its core?
So I think telling the story of someone, of Fannie Lou Hamer and others like her who persevered, they endured, and they stood up to the violence and the oppression. This is hard. It's like teaching the history of slavery. It's hard history, and to strike that balance between the violence, and you don't want it to become a trope and that people become inured to it and immune to it. It's part of telling the story and empowering people to claim that history and move forward with it. I think it's an ongoing process, but we have to tell these stories. If we keep talking about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, we're not getting at these stories, and we're not seeing that, gee, damn, we haven't gotten very far since what happened in Mississippi. Now we have hundreds of pieces of legislation around the country in states that are trying to restrict voting rights. We're going backwards. We can't allow this to happen. The violence is reemerging. We can't, we've got to look to the Fannie Lou Hamers, excuse me, of the world and try to figure out, they had strategies. Maybe there are strategies there that we can capture and use again.
Yeah, I would just like to add it is a very, very hard story, but I think it is a essential story for American consciousness. It is our story, both the violence and the work of Black Americans pushing against it with nonviolent means. That is a remarkable history of implementation of non-harmful response to power, non-killing response to power that affected many people elsewhere that had similar brutal struggles against systemic oppression. I have one question about her. I had read that she went to Africa.
She
Is
did.
that correct? And there was a very moving very moving reflection that she had about that trip regarding her own mother. Being in, I don't know if you ever came across it, but she was at a setting where she realized, if only my mother had lived long enough and been able to come
See this.
back. Could you talk about that for a minute?
She went to Africa after the Democratic National Convention, and she and her colleagues were just wiped out and angry and upset. And Harry Belafonte felt that they needed some rejuvenation, so he paid for a trip for her and a dozen other people, including John Lewis, to Africa. So when Hamer got there, she couldn't believe that, like, the host, the airline, I'm going to call them stewardesses, but the women on the airlines were Black women, that bank presidents were Black, everyone in business. It was there. She could not believe that this was the world there. And that so in her family, they had passed down these generations of stories about slavery and the robbing of their African names and the rape of their ancestors and having all these children and the struggles that they went through. So when she was there in Africa, it hit her that she wished that her mother could see these proud women and powerful people, her people. And so it was another transformational moment for Hamer. And she brought that up in speeches frequently, very frequently. I'd also like to say something back about the violence and the nonviolent response. Pap Hamer was a hunter. He had many guns. And I often think about what restraint it took for him to not use those guns after his wife was beaten and raped and treated so badly. He restrained himself. He committed to supporting her and not, going out and committing violence too. And those SNCC workers, Bob Moses and the rest, they were so dedicated. They didn't want any of the workers to carry guns. And some of them died because they didn't have guns to protect themselves. But it was a commitment that they made. And for Fannie Lou Hamer, that was the right commitment that she had to go forward with, especially after SNCC turned in a different revolutionary manner.
We have a question here about, and maybe we'll take this last one, and then if you want to remind us when how to access your book. There was a request for a list of resources that people might go to learn more about Fannie Lou. But the question is, what happened to the land that she and her husband purchased and the farms that were there?
So it was a farm cooperative. Some of the land was lost. It was just, there are lots of circumstances about how it failed. But a portion of the land was purchased through the efforts of one of the close SNCC workers that worked with Fannie Lou Hamer, Charles McLaurin, and he got a foundation in the city of Ruleville to purchase parts of that land, and she's actually buried on it today. Her grave sits on portions of that former farm co-op. So you can see her grave there. As far as resources, there are so many resources online now, and I encourage everybody to please check them out. At the Smithsonian website, there is a collection called the Moon Collection, and those are audio tapes of many speeches in the early SNCC movement in 63 and 64. You can hear Fannie Lou Hamer's speeches and her singing. The Historical Society of Wisconsin has an amazing website on Freedom Summer. The archives in Mississippi, there's so many websites now. SNCC Digital, just type in SNCC Digital on Google, you'll find that. And Civil Rights Movement Veterans website has a tremendous number of resources for teachers, for just education to look at, primary sources, interviews, music, it's all there. It's amazing what's available for resources on the internet. So even in COVID times, you have access to a lot.
Thank you. I would add to that the Civil Rights Digital Library, which I think is collated out of Mississippi, but it's incredible. It's
Yeah.
incredible. They
Yeah.
have an enormous amount of resources. Is she memorialized in Ruralville besides the gravesite? Are there?
Yes, there's a statue there to her. You know, I think there probably could be more, but it's hard. It's still very poor and very rural. You know, it's Mississippi still is at the bottom of the rankings for practically everything in this country. And I think she might be a little disappointed if she were here today to see that while voting has changed and more Black congressmen and representatives come from Mississippi than any other state, it hasn't translated into better education, better healthcare access, economic status, et cetera.
Well, we want to thank you so much. Your book is going to be coming out in October. That's correct.
Right,
And
right.
we try to highlight that in one of our e-blast. But thank you so much for what is an essential history for us.
Thank you.
We need to be studying this to learn how to build a culture of peace, to learn how to create a society for the common good. So thank you. And thank you for all joining. To repeat, this will be available on our website. This was recorded. And have a wonderful day, everybody. So
thank you.
Thank you
And
so
also
much.
find these heroes in your communities and support them and elevate them and make sure that they are taken care of because they need sustenance as well.